Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Colorado State University Prevention Extension Cast, where today we'll be discussing the do's and don'ts of community prevention program evaluations. I'm Dr. Nate Riggs. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the executive director of the CSU Prevention Research Center, otherwise known as the PRC. And I'm joining you from my office on CSU's campus in Alder Hall. I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Dave MacPhee, who is the PRC's Director of Community University Partnerships and Professor Emeritus in CSU's Department of Human Development and Family Studies, where he teaches courses in prevention science, prevention program implementation, and prevention program evaluation, among many others. So as you're starting to recognize, Dave clearly doesn't know what the word emeritus means in his title. It means retired Dave. In fact, he knows well what that means. And refers to himself as a failed retiree, which is of great benefit to the Prevention Research Center. Dave is also the first three-time guest of the Prevention Extension Cast, an honor that I'm sure ranks up there with his career highlights. But when we heard from our audience that program evaluation was a topic of really great importance and interest, there was no question in my mind whose arm I needed to twist to be the guest today. And when those three people said no, I reached out to Dave. So just kidding, Dave. How are you doing today, my friend?
I am doing fine. I'm doing fine, and retired means tired all over again, right? So thanks for kidding with me. I've enjoyed the work, and I'm glad I'm back in the saddle.
Great. It's great to have you here. So for those of you who have yet to join us on the Prevention Extension Cast, I'll be moderating a 45-minute Q&A with Dave about prevention program evaluation. And then after that, we'll have some time for our guests, all of you in the audience, to ask some questions. And I will forward those to Dave. So if you have any questions throughout the discussion today, please put them in the Q&A, which should be up in the upper right-hand corner of your Teams Live event. And I will relay them, as I said, today. So, and as always, I'd like to thank the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture for providing funding to support the Prevention Extension Cast. So let's get started on our conversation about prevention program evaluation. I think probably the first most logical question to ask right here is, Dave, can you please describe what community prevention program evaluation is and why it is so important?
I invented a new word for that, with the B, with the by. It depends on whether we are working with someone in the community or it is done by someone in the community, and those are very different, I would say. So my work in community program evaluation is invariably in collaboration, quite often with somebody in extension, where they are the program implementer, I am the program evaluator, and we collaborate in the grant writing, the design. We'll get to a logic model later, the goals and objectives. So that part is very much a with my partners on the implementation side. For many reasons, I try to stay a little bit removed from the implementation process other than evaluating it. But another meaning, the by, would be where the community individuals would conduct their own program evaluations. There are strengths and weaknesses of doing that we'll get to later. So to me, it's a synonym for collaboration. Collaborative program evaluation is. So why it's so important? I think there are two reasons there. My community partners always know the community better than I do. And I need to rely on that information in terms of if I have to adapt the outcome measures for any reason for different groups, readability, that kind of a thing. If there are dynamics in the community that need to be assessed, I need to rely on my partner for doing that. The collaboration is important because I have a skill set that's quite research-based, for example, that most community partners do not have. Puts a burden on me to explain those like findings from a research perspective in ways that are understandable to my community partners. So lots of practical reasons for why the collaboration is important. You're muted.
There we go. Okay, so as you alluded to in your answer to the last question, so, some communities have the capacity to have internal staff conduct evaluations, and other times it works best for them to choose someone or an external team to conduct that evaluation for them. I imagine that there are pros and cons to both approaches. Can you tell us what those might be?
I think the primary one for me, and the reason to keep our roles somewhat separate, at least from the implementation stage on, would be ethical boundaries. That it's hard for me in a collaboration, building trust, that kind of a thing, to be completely removed, completely remote, not invested in the program's success, but it's more likely that I have a dispassionate perspective on the results if I'm not involved in the implementation. It's too tempting sometimes to say, well, I'll ignore this data file because it's not consistent with a favorable outcome or something like that. I wouldn't say that's ever happened to me, but I acknowledge and I'm very much aware that it could be a source of bias if roles are confabulated between the implementer and the evaluator. So that would be a con on both sides. The temptation is to tilt the results to favorable outcomes. Like I said before, the pros, I suppose, of having the local staff conduct their evaluation is they're more familiar with the folks who are going to be receiving the program, their preferences, their values, that kind of a thing, so they can design the evaluation, select the measures that are better aligned than someone who's more remote like I am at the university. That would be a pro for them. And a pro for having an external evaluator would be if the program goes well, if it's got a pretty significant impact, it's got more credibility if an external dispassionate review evaluator did the review. For example, a lot of registries of evidence-based programs give more credit, if you will, if it's done by an external evaluator who is not an insider, that kind of a thing. It's got more credibility.
Sounds great. So in those cases where communities choose to go with the external evaluator, do you have any recommendations for how closely evaluators should work with program implementers? For example, I hear of this tension between whether external evaluators should be completely removed from everything other than the evaluation itself, kind of that dispassionate evaluator, as you mentioned, to ensure objectivity versus being involved throughout the process, even from the beginning, including when decisions are being made related to implementation and those kind of things. What are your thoughts or recommendations around that?
This will be a two-part answer. I'll begin with lived examples from my professional career because I have followed a pretty consistent pattern, and then I'll get all academia on you for just a minute and talk about a couple of different approaches that I use out of the 12 or so that are in the literature. So practically speaking, from the get-go, I've been doing program evaluation collaboratively for almost 40 years. And from the very beginning, working with Jan Miller-Heil on the Dare to Be You program, what I learned from here is how fundamental it is to have an agreement between the implementation side and the evaluation side around the theory of change and the logic model that results from it. And that logic model will always should consist of the goals and objectives. So Jan and I, and more recently in the Family Leadership Training Institute, I've been working with for about 10 years with Patty Schmidt, also an extension. We sit down together when we're writing a grant or launching a project, and we come to an agreement about the theory of change and the logic model, and in particular, what are our 2 to 3 major goals and what are the objectives that support them. Once we come to agreement, then whether it's Jan or Patty, they would use that document to guide their creation of the curriculum, for example. And I would use those objectives to identify the outcome measures, pre and post test measures that we would use in the evaluation. So the coming together is like the fundamental skeleton of the program, and the bifurcation would be the implementation side, the deliverables, and the evaluation side, kind of a thing. And before we went online here, I went back to you and I have both taught the graduate program evaluation, prevention program evaluation class. And I wanted to refresh my memory about some of the orientation. So to your question about being completely objective versus being very much enmeshed, if you will, in the implementation process. On the far end of objectivity would be an experimental approach where you maintain your distance as an evaluator. That is good for objectivity. It's not so good for being familiar with the local conditions, what they need, that kind of a thing. So it's a balancing act there. On the other end would be an empowerment approach where you are a coach for the implementation folks. You encourage self-determination, that kind of a thing. It's very hard to maintain any objectivity in that when you're very much wrapped up in that. I tend to be in the middle ground in terms of I'm a goal-oriented evaluator. That means I'm a mentor, I'm a collaborator. It means I also might overlook some unintended consequences, and we might end up talking about that later. That's one thing I've learned from doing evaluation is kind of a blind spot to that, but I very much emphasize being a collaborator. I also am a mixed methods kind of approach. So the qualitative interviews are more comfortable to the implementation folks that can kind of wrap their head around narratives about their program. I'm less likely to miss unintended consequences that way. But I'm also deeply a quantitative kind of person with statistics and research design. So that kind of fits into a mixed methods, goal-oriented approach that embraces collaboration. So there's a spectrum from complete objectivity to completely being wrapped up in the implementation side. I'm somewhere in the middle. And I think many evaluators are as well. So you got an academic answer and a practical answer.
No, that sounds great. I think it makes a lot of sense that it's more of a continuum. It depends in large part on communities' needs. I wonder if it also depends on how mature the program is too. When in the beginning, in the first stages of testing out this brand new approach or program or curriculum, there's more engagement with the evaluator. And then once all the kinks are worked out, then maybe a more hands-off objective approach might be useful.
Yeah, I could make a counter argument. I do agree with you there. And I'm thinking about the well-known evidence-based programs where one reason they're on the registries for evidence-based is that at some point they have hired a dispassionate evaluator who is not aligned or hasn't worked with the program from the get-go. So there might be a countervailing impetus, if you will, to hire an external evaluator if you think you have come up with a good enough idea that it could be on an evidence-based registry. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I could see both perspectives. In my experience, both with Dare to Be You and the Family Leadership Training Institute, over time, I have become more and more of an insider. I root for their success, that kind of a thing. That's been beneficial in giving feedback to them because we built trusting relationships, that kind of a thing. And when there's been a fail, for example, they haven't turned out as planned, we're all comfortable trying to figure out what happened and how we could make improvements, that kind of a thing. So that for me, the longer I've worked with folks, the more involved I am in the at least giving feedback on what might be going on with the implementation, for example.
Great. So speaking of relationships between evaluators and implementers, how does one go about establishing solid working relationships between program implementers and evaluators that really minimizes those potential pitfalls or problems?
5-letter word, I think it would be fundamental, and that would be trust. And kind of reflecting on the wonderful working relationships I've had over the years, especially with folks in Extension, that trust is built on at least two things in my point of view. One is being very open in communication. I've been called out on some mistakes by my collaborators, and I've called them out on some things. And I don't like that phrase called out, but you get what, an open channel of communication that's bi-directional would be one fundamental unit of it. Like Jan and Patty would by now know, yeah, I can talk to Dave about some uncomfortable things about how the program's going, doing problem solving, that sort of thing. I think another element of trust that is fundamental to the relationship is recognizing the skill set that each of the partners has, whether it's the program manager like Patty, the Patties and Jans of the world, or it is the facilitators who are well trained and have the background to do it adequately, or it's me who has a toolbox of statistical methods, research methods, that kind of a thing, and is familiar with the literature and can pull in research. So I would see those as two common elements of having a really enduring relationship. And the two fails I can think of that completely fell apart in doing evaluation work, both of those were missing, where the work wasn't getting done by the other party. There wasn't open communication when it really needed to be there. In both cases, I felt a little bit deceived by things that went south and could have been anticipated if there had been more open communication. So I think I would boil it down to those two fundamentals in particular.
Right, thanks. So, we've been talking a lot about examples where communities engage with external partners for program evaluation. If communities have the capacity to conduct a quote unquote in-house evaluation, what are your top recommendations for ensuring quality data collection, interpreting results, and disseminating findings, among other evaluation activities?
Well, on my list of to-dos there, not all of them are easily doable, but like you said before, it's not a good idea to develop your own measures. So if at all possible, use a pre-existing evaluation survey or surveys that were recommended by the program developer. The program developers would be in the best position to know the program's goals and objectives and what measures align well with them. They probably worked out what the readability level of them is, whether they're appropriate for different cultural groups, that kind of a thing. When they're not available, then consult with a professional evaluator like yours truly, the two of us in the PRC, or maybe an extension director or agent could refer you to some solid measures. Recently, I've had a couple of graduate students come into my office and we were brainstorming about evaluation, and I pointed over to my bookshelf and I probably have 8 feet of bookshelf of just measurements and one whole big file drawer of measurements. I've collected them over time for all kinds of reasons, and they're invaluable. You know, it's a library of, if you've got this outcome, here's a range of options for different ages, some of them translated, that kind of a thing. So you're not likely to find that kind of resource on your local community agency bookshelf. So that would be, measures are just so fundamental to doing program evaluation. And then discuss evaluation support options with the funder. You know, so we've been funded by Head Start, Center for Substance Abuse Prevention, you know, different state agencies. They might have some idea of what measures are predominantly used for certain outcomes in their field. So that might be another option.
Great. All right, so you referred to logic models in one of your previous responses, and I think this is really relevant, whether communities are engaging an external evaluator or whether they are conducting an in-house evaluation. Can you tell us all what a logic model is and how it's important for guiding program evaluations?
So a logic model consists of two fundamental parts, and each of those two would be either in the evaluators, well, I should say the more applied researcher's wheelhouse or the implementer. So a logic model consists of a theory of change that would typically be in my bailiwick as a faculty member, for example, familiar with the research, which would be the guiding principle for a theory of change. What underlies substance abuse, for example? What underlies conduct disorders? There are rich literatures on all of those kind of commonly targeted outcomes in adolescence. What about readiness for school? So in our teaching and our own research, we become familiar with the literature, and that would be the grist for a theory of change. Some of them are incredibly complex, and that's one of my failures as an evaluator, is writing overly complex theories of change. And then the Jan Miller-Hiles of the world will say, well, Dave, in this thing on teen parenting, you've got early onset menstrual period. We're not going to do a whole lot with that in an intervention, but it does predict certain kinds of things like teen pregnancy. On the other side of a logic model would be all the nuts and bolts of the deliverables of a program, staffing patterns, resource distribution, that kind of a thing. So that's why we need to collaborate. I and my community collaborator is bringing together the theory of change, what we're going to target, and what resources are needed for that. So once you've got those two elements, there will be sort of a synergy in, well, what's our long-term goal we're reaching for? And under that, what are some specific objectives? What behaviors do we want to change? By how much? By what, within what time frame, kind of a thing. And like I said before, I heavily depend on the objectives in designing the evaluation plan. One drawback of being too dependent on objectives is you might overlook some unintended beneficial consequences. And that's happened to me a couple of times. Are you going to ask a question about that later, or should I answer it now?
Go for it now.
Yeah. All right. Here's one reason I like mixed methods, and it does relate back to objectives that are part of the logic model. With the Family Leadership Training Institute evaluation, I was getting reports from the staff that the graduates that they maintain contact with in the local community were doing phenomenal work out in the community, making community level changes, which is the whole plan for the FLTI program. And they wanted some documentation of that beyond a long-term follow-up survey. So I put together a brief survey, but also found out about results mapping interviews, half-an-hour interviews about transformational change. And of the 56 interviews, 49 of them just had amazing transformational changes to themselves, greater education, life course alterations, that kind of stuff. But 7 of them said, well, I didn't really do much with what I learned in the program. And for many of those 7, it was a case of where they ran into obstacles, they just kind of gave up, didn't stick with it. And I thought, this sounds familiar. Persistence, grit, self-efficacy, that kind of a thing. So I asked some of the facilitators on staff, is there any way that you go about encouraging grit, persistence when they run into blowback from like the county commissioners or somebody in a decision-making position where they have to approve an initiative that you're proposing? He said, oh yeah, we say this, that, and the other. So, well, we're not measuring it, but it seems like an important outcome. So that's where the qualitative research told me, well, that wasn't an objective in our logic model, but it's certainly something that they attend to in the intervention, and it has important consequences for the long-term benefits of the program. So maybe we should start measuring it as a pre and a post test. So in the last couple of iterations of FLTI, we included a measure of grit, and sure enough, the program is having a significant impact on pre and post test grit. So back to the logic model. Wasn't an objective, but yet it was an outcome that maybe wasn't completely intended, but they certainly are attentive to that as an issue to be addressed in their curriculum. So long-winded way of saying, you don't want to be completely dependent on your objectives. You want to keep an open mind and listen carefully to what the folks enrolled in the program are telling you, both how did you benefit from the program, ask open-ended questions at the end of it, and then do long-term follow-ups to see how they're using what they learned and if we've overlooked something in terms of a valuable outcome.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. So, I think a lot of times think about evaluation and their minds go directly towards an outcome evaluation, measuring outcomes. How do we make change? Which is certainly important. Can you tell us the importance of what a process evaluation is, the importance of a process evaluation, and how it might differ from an outcome evaluation?
Okay, and I'm going to back up a little bit and walk through the different stages of program evaluation, but you highlight probably the main difference in 2 forms of it. So one thing I have on my note is have an advisory board from the beginning, so that represents the community, so you have some input into what's going to be delivered, the implementation of the process, and what the outcomes are. And you want to make those both tailored to the local demographic profile and the needs, that kind of a thing. Identifying and using measures that are appropriate, that kind of a thing. I tell all kinds of tales in the program evaluation class about, working with especially Native American populations where some of the language of measures is not well aligned with their culture. So that's part 1. The second part would be doing a needs assessment, so that you are tailoring the program to those needs and doing the appropriate measures. But to your main question, a process evaluation goes by the name of a formative evaluation or an implementation evaluation. Your first obligation as an evaluator is to determine whether the program is being delivered as planned. If it's not being delivered as planned, that could be a fundamental explanation for why you're not finding an impact. If the dosage is not up to snuff, which happens a lot with home visitation programs, for example, a common failure there is inadequate dosage. If you're running out of time consistently, which happens, that's 85% of the deviations from implementation, so you're not getting adequate dosage there. So You want to have sufficient data about implementation so that if it is working, if the program does have good evidence of impact, other people can replicate it, and they need a roadmap to do that. And that's where the implementation evaluation comes in. A summative evaluation or an impact evaluation is, okay, we know the roadmap, it's being delivered according to plan. What kind of outcomes is it having? What kind of impact? Is it having the desired impact according to the objectives and goals of the program? So that would be a little bit higher stakes kind of a thing. Some funders are likely, if it's a new area that they're funding, to emphasize the implementation or process evaluation. They want to know if it's a workable plan. Others, like Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, where a lot of the approaches are well worked out, they may be more likely to fund a summative or an impact evaluation. Let's focus on, is this delivery to this new group having the same impact as the track record that's already been developed? So what's being delivered would be the first one. Is it having the desired outcome? That would be the second one.
Nice. One of the things that is striking to me is that we could probably have a companion webcast or podcast specifically on program evaluation. Yeah. We're really just able to scratch the surface here in this 45 minutes here that we have with you. And so really want to reiterate that we do have the Q&A open, so that if our audience members have questions that dig a little bit deeper, then please feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll get those relayed to Dave. So, all right. So switching shifting to the topic of program adaptation. So we at the PRC, we've been doing a lot of work in adapting our best practices for adapting evidence-based programs to meet cultural context and fit and need. So I'm gonna offer this question up on a tee for you to smash out of the park. Should these adaptations be evaluated? All right. And if so, then how would you recommend that we do that?
You want the 10-second answer or the 1 hour anscer?
The well, 10-second answer in between, then
all right. The 10-second answer would be yes. The longer answer would be, what a complex process. So in the PRC, we have like a 40, 50, 60 page document about adaptations and what's a green light, what's a red light, that kind of a thing. But the fundamental answer is yes. You should always measure the impact of an adaptation fundamentally, so you know if what you're doing is beneficial to the community and its community members. You would have an obligation, I would think, ethical and practical, to your stakeholders in your local community. You don't want to be delivering stuff that's wasting their time. And more broadly, and one I think that's overlooked too often, is a bit of an obligation to the broader profession, of doing prevention science and what works and what does not work. So I have on my wish list here, it's not really a response to a question, but I wish we had a repository of evaluation reports from community-led evaluations of evidence-based programs that have been adapted for different audiences. Many of them won't have a control or a comparison group, but if they've been adapted for diverse groups, we need to know what's working and what's not. So yes, if they're made, they should be evaluated. How do you go about doing that? Well, hire an evaluator or do very careful documentation of what you are delivering, and what are, in particular, what are the deviations from the protocol of the evidence-based program? You know, so if you do make those adaptations, ideally they would be green or yellow light, but document, keep track of them like in a management information system, and then somehow get the word out. Maybe it will be through the developer of the evidence-based program. Hey, we tried this out with a Native American population or with an older group of kids, and these outcomes we did find an impact, these ones we did not, just so you know. So fold that into the information you provide to other people replicating the program, that kind of thing. We don't do that very much in prevention science, and part of the reason is that it is so difficult to get on the registries. They don't, unless the adaptations have a control or a comparison group, it's just really hard to get on the registries where they're widely available. And I wish we had a way of circumventing that problem.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like an incomplete answer. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. You've been as involved as I have in the work we've been doing in the PRC around adaptations, but it's truly a thorny issue, a very complex one that I have to empathize with the people out in the communities. And, you know, can we do this? Can we do that? How do we go about doing that? Give us some guidance. I think the work we've been doing in the PRC has been very helpful with that, though.
Well, to that point, what resources would you recommend for agencies looking for evaluation information and or support that could help with these types of thorny issues?
All right, so a list brain dump here. Fidelity checklists that the PRC has in our implementation toolbox, sometimes program websites will have materials. The prevention research, the epicenter at Penn State, which you're very familiar with, would be an example. Sometimes surveys and code books from the program developers, the epicenter website, which you might put in the Q&A or the chat section. Agencies sometimes have evaluation staff support that they could rely on. I know from working both with Extension and some school districts that at least the bigger school districts and sometimes the larger counties in Colorado might have someone on staff who's familiar with doing program evaluations and also doing adaptations of programs. So they might have some backgrounds. Reaching out to the Prevention Research Center for additional resources. So there are resources out there that can be hard to find, though, honestly. Mm-hmm. I would recommend the PRC or the epicenter, and the two of us in particular would have resources, or at the very least would know where to find them.
Right. Yeah, you know, I can empathize with community partners. I mean, it sounds like evaluation is hard, and there's a lot of things to consider. And I think a fundamental question that I have for you, Dave, is let's say a community partner were to come to you and say, hey, prevention, it costs money, and I'm struggling to find the benefit to cost ratio of doing evaluation. What would you say to that community partner to convince them that evaluation really is worth it?
Well, there would be a negative message, I guess I would convey, is that in the literature, there are reports of iatrogenic effects, of where I know of one out of a very well-regarded outfit in Oregon, where they implemented a prevention program with 14-year-olds around preventing cigarette smoking, tobacco use. And what happened is norms of risk-taking were created among the teens, and the outcomes just went down the toilet It was counterproductive. Probably the poster child would be the DARE program. 50% of the evaluations of that showed no change, and 50% were harmful. Same thing with abstinence-only education around teen pregnancy. All that does is delay age of first intercourse by 6 months, but it increases the rate of teen pregnancy. Without evaluation, we would not know that you're having a harmful effect. So I think we need to do due diligence to our community partners and citizens to document that the money is being invested wisely, and in particular, we're not being harmful. I think we're usually confident we're not harming people, but we can't be assured of that. More and more, I think with being conservative and budgeting, we need to justify expenditures. So that would be another reason that our intervention may not have a huge effect, but if there's enough moving of the needle to justify the expenditures, then the program continues. It gets disseminated more widely to the benefit of the full population. So without that evidence that evaluation gives you, it's a little bit harder to make a sell in getting the funding and getting the community on board to the benefits of the program, where they don't roll their eyes and say, you get one more thing on my plate. Well, no, it's going to help your family, whatever it is. Your kids are going to perform better in school. We hold teachers accountable. Having been married to a first grade teacher, we should hold our interventions accountable to the same kind of standard, that it's benefiting the recipients. So that's my soapbox.
No, I appreciate that, Dave. Okay, so we have about 5 more minutes in our planned Q&A. I just want to give one more pitch for folks to enter some of their own questions, audience members to enter their own questions in the Q&A. Hopefully you're able to access that and drop your questions in. I've got a couple of kind of personal experience questions for you, Dave. The first one is, can you share with the audience some of your own personal experiences conducting program evaluations that you have considered either successes and maybe more interesting failures?
Yeah, the failures are kind of funny. I have no reservations about sharing those in class, and in prepping for this conversation, I seem to have repressed most of them, funny enough. But just right off the top of my head, one that comes to mind is in writing evaluation reports. And I remember the very first grant that I had with Jan Miller-Heil in the Dare to Be You program. I wrote like this 20-page single-spaced tome. And when we had a site visit, our project director from the funder started laughing, and not laughing at me, but just saying, this reads like a technical report for a journal, Dave. It does not read like an evaluation report. You need to be very concrete so that a high school educated facilitator in the program could understand it, and your community collaborators could understand it. And frankly, I was very embarrassed, and I did laugh at myself, but she was absolutely right. Lesson learned about communication. And that's carried over in some ways to my benefit, in that for a lot of my evaluations, we have small sample sizes of maybe a dozen folks in one iteration in one community at a time. You're not going to find statistical significance very easily there, which is sort of the everyday standard for program impact. So I have gravitated to using effect sizes. Those are harder to explain to my collaborators in the program. So I have had to learn how to communicate clearly what an effect size is, why it's important, that kind of a thing. I wouldn't call them failures, just lessons learned are, one is selecting measures. I have learned the difference between state and trait measures. For example, in working in Dare to Be You, we called Jan the queen of self-esteem, but really it's about self-efficacy and locus of control. Turns out that the first time I used a measure of locus of control, it was a state or a trait-based measure. Trait-based measures say, I am like this in my personality. It's an enduring characteristics. Well, if it's enduring, it's not going to be sensitive to an intervention. And we found no change on it, go figure. And I finally figured out from personality theory, what I need is a state-based one. In the last 2 weeks, I've felt like this, much more sensitive to an intervention. So I've learned a lot about, whoops, are we on still? Okay. I have learned to be much more judicious in selecting measures. I've learned how to communicate more clearly about outcomes, that kind of thing. But overall, it's been a wonderful career. I mean, everything I could tell you would be a success, except for a few glitches that I've learned from. I love the collaborative part of it. Generally, I have benefited from my 2 favorite classes in my doctoral program, which would be my statistics courses and a program taught by the former undersecretary in the U.S. Department of Education on program evaluation, James Gallagher. Those have been lifelong lessons that I put into practice, and it's led to a very fulfilling career doing program evaluation. Complex, yes, but oh good heavens, working with community members and my collaborators in developing and implementing programs has been a blast, just so rewarding in so many ways. It's been a blessing. Mostly successful, a few glitches that I can laugh at.
Well, there's no question why you are the Community University Partnerships Director here at the PRC, because of the really authentic and impactful partnerships that you've had with communities around Colorado and really beyond. So really appreciate that about you, Dave. All right, so what would any do's or don'ts webinar be without a rapid fire do or don't session? So here we go, Dave. This is going to be, I'm gonna read off a series of statements, and I'd like you to reply with either do or don't. And since we don't have any questions yet in the chat that I can see, why don't you go ahead, you can either say do or don't really quickly, and then maybe provide a quick example or rationale for why you're saying that. Okay, so for the first do or don't, use a logic model to guide measurement selection.
So would it be from South Park where they would say, oh, do, yes.
Do, okay. So use the logic model for measurement selection. All right, do or don't, develop your own measures to assess outcomes.
Don't, with the qualifier that only if you're in the position where no such measure exists, or if it does, it can't be adapted for your use. But generally, it's a bad idea. And here's the elaboration on that. One of the courses that I've taught before is tests and measurements, and also research methods. And what we know is that if you develop your own measure, you have no idea at all if it's a reliable and valid measure. And trust me, probably the thing I'm most well known for is developing a couple of measures. And in one instance, it's been a 30-year work of love and sweat and tears to validate it. With the Civic Capacity Index that my 2 colleagues and I developed, that was 2 years ago when we initiated it. It's been a very intensive process, and we're only now reassured that it's a reliable and valid measure. That's 2 years into it with a lot of resources, grant funding to develop it. So really bad idea to develop your own measure. You just don't know if it's reliable and valid.
Okay, well, this is really relevant to a question that we now have in the Q&A. That question being, what can you do if the measures you would like to use have not been translated into the language you would like to use them for?
Great question. And I've got a two-part answer. I face that a lot of the time, especially here in Colorado, where Spanish is quite often a language used. And I know for a fact on the Eastern Plains, there are some languages that African immigrants use. So I'm more and more reliant on Qualtrics for surveys, and they have an automatic translation process, and it's dozens and dozens of languages. So when I know that I'm going to be working with a bilingual population, I automatically have it translated into Spanish. That's part one. Now, what I found, one of my collaborators in the FLTI program, Illyria, is fluent in Spanish, bilingual. I always have her check the translations. Most of the time, they're quite accurate on Qualtrics, but there are some exceptions. Qualtrics tends to use a more formal language. Illyria is more familiar with the variants of Spanish that are more typically used in communities. So I have her check the Spanish translation. Sometimes when I'm in a pinch, I check with like online translations. They tend not to be as good as Qualtrics. So that's a long-winded answer. But if you do use Qualtrics, you'll find that it translates into multiple languages. One more example is our Civic Capacity Index is being used in Kansas with a community where many of them speak German, and Qualtrics translated it into German as well. So that's a very easy to use platform that I would recommend, at least as the first and pretty good step. Otherwise, hire a translator. They can be expensive.
All right. All right, do or don't. Develop a plan for sharing results with community partners / funders.
100% of the time, yes, absolutely do it. Don't write it like a dissertation or a research paper, though. So there are different ways of writing those so that they're clear, the plan, but absolutely do that.
Okay. Do or don't. Wait until data are collected before you reach out to external program evaluators.
What's that? The horse is out of the barn before it closes, whatever. Absolutely don't do that. It's really hard as an evaluator to go back and patch things up after the fact. You know, the best use of everyone's time and to ensure that you're more likely to have results that are detected would be to collaborate with the evaluator from the get-go, writing the logic model with the objectives and the goals, for example. So don't.
All right. Do or don't. Include funds in your budget for evaluation, if allowable.
Do you want the honest answer or the lived experience one? I mean, the honest and ethical one is do include funds for evaluation. Most grant agencies allow about a 10% of the budget to be devoted to evaluation, sometimes more, that kind of a thing. Honestly, I'm so invested and interested in the work, and I realize a lot of the community agencies are in very tight budgets, that I do it pro bono and use it as a tax write-off kind of a thing. I probably 80, 90% of my evaluation work is pro bono with community agencies where they simply can't afford it. And if it's simple and straightforward enough, I really don't mind the time. It develops goodwill between CSU and the community, for example. It establishes collaborations. And if the results are promising, we might end up writing a grant, that would fund it. Maybe not the answer you'd want to hear, Nate. Nate's sort of my boss, and free labor, no, don't do that, Dave. But you got to realize that the bind a lot of community agencies are in.
Yeah, I mean, we are a land grant university, right? And we have a mission
Right.
to engage with our community partners and be there as a resource. And in that spirit, I've put in the Q&A, the Prevention Research Center email, and please feel free to reach out to us with any evaluation related questions or any prevention related questions for that matter. We're here to help. Right. Do or don't use program developers' existing evaluation material if available.
Absolutely. Again, to reiterate, they're familiar, intimately familiar with goals and objectives that would guide, if not dictate, the outcome measures. And in order to document that it's an evidence-based program, they would have had to use well-aligned measures. So that would be the first option, yes.
Okay. Do or don't. If existing evaluation materials are not available, reach out to the CSU Prevention Research Center for help.
And we've got a lot of expertise in that area, so definitely do that, right? And if we don't have an answer right off the bat, we usually know where to find them. So for example, in working with grad students in their own research, sometimes they're measuring an outcome I'm not familiar with, and I go to PsycInfo and do a lit search, find out what other people in the same area have been using, contact the authors for the measure or find it in some way. So if we don't have it in hand, we know how to find it usually.
All right. All right. Last do or don't and last call for questions from the audience. All right. Do or don't, when retired, accept Nate's offer to become the PRC Director of Community University Partnerships.
How long did I hesitate in doing that? That's your answer. I don't think I hesitated at all, Nate. So no, in my own defense, I found, well, to share stories out of family, I retired mostly to care for my terminally ill wife who had Alzheimer's. So that's the heartbreaker. And when she moved to memory care, I just found I had restless brain syndrome. So I am so happy to be in the PRC's orbit and doing good work out in the community. I don't have any regrets at all. You know, sometimes I wonder where my next paycheck's coming from, which grant or something like that, but that's hardly a cause for having white hair. But no, I don't believe I hesitated in responding to your offer, Nate. Did I?
No.
I think you got a reply email within about a minute. So are you kidding me? Sounds like a blast. I love doing community engaged work. So
well,
yeah.
it is to the great benefit of our communities, and we just really appreciate your willingness to engage, and most specifically with the Prevention Extension Cast today and in the previous times that you've been a guest. And I just really want to thank you for your time today, Dave. I want to thank our audience for their time. As I said, we just scratched the surface with program evaluation, and we're here to dig in with you. If you have any further questions outside of the context of this webcast. But since there are no other questions, I just want to wish everybody a happy Tuesday, and you can find all of the other Prevention Extension casts at the link provided within the Q&A. This one will be uploaded onto our website and onto our Prevention Research Center YouTube channel very soon. And I guess I will say adios and take care, and we'll see you next time.